The bus dropped me off 2 blocks from the Lunenburg waterfront. I shouldered my duffel bag and walked toward the harbor, the mid-April wind cutting through my jacket. After 3 weeks of searching for work in Halifax with no luck, I'd followed up on a tip about a fishing crew looking for an extra hand. The pay was good, suspiciously good, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. The harbor spread out before me as I crested the hill, fishing boats bobbing in the gray water. Most were already secured for the evening, their crews gone home or headed to local bars. I checked the slip number from the ad I'd answered and made my way down the weathered planks of the dock. The Mary Catherine was smaller than I expected, maybe 40 feet long, with a weather-beaten hull that had seen better days. A stocky man in his late 40s stood on deck, securing equipment. He looked up as my boots thumped on the dock. "You Mitchell?" he called out. "Yes, sir, James Mitchell." I set my bag down. "Hear about the crew position?" He nodded once, his face giving nothing away. "Robert Stevens, captain of the Mary Catherine." He didn't offer to shake hands, just jerked his chin toward the boat. "Come aboard." I stepped carefully onto the deck, taking in the worn but well-maintained equipment. 3 other men were working in different areas of the boat. Captain Stevens pointed to each in turn. My brother David, William Torres, Thomas Wright. Each man nodded or raised a hand in greeting, but continued working. David, who looked a few years younger than the captain but with the same sturdy build, approached with a clipboard. "You got experience?" he asked. "Some. Worked on a recreational charter out of Sydney for 2 summers during college." David exchanged a look with his brother that I couldn't read. "This isn't recreation," he said. "Commercial fishing's different, especially here." I nodded. "I'm a quick learner." "You'll need to be," Captain Stevens said. He turned to his brother. "Give him the list." David reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to me. "These are the rules. Memorize them. Your life depends on it." I unfolded the paper, expecting safety protocols or information about equipment. Instead, I found a handwritten list of 6 items. 1. Never comment on the weather at sea, not even to say it's nice. 2. Don't think about loved ones while on the water. Keep your mind on the work. 3. If you hear your name called from the sea, ignore it. Tell someone immediately. 4. If you catch a fish that speaks, throw it back without saying a word. 5. Every person aboard must catch at least 1 fish each trip. 6. The captain must catch his own fish. Never give him yours. I looked up, expecting to see smirks or laughter, some indication this was a joke they played on newcomers. Instead, all 4 men watched me with deadly serious expressions. "Is this some kind of local superstition?" I asked, trying to keep my tone respectful. William, a wiry man in his mid-30s with dark eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning the horizon, spoke for the first time. "You can call it that if you want, just follow them." "The man you're replacing thought they were just superstitions too," Captain Stevens said flatly. "Decided Rule 6 didn't matter much last month." "What happened to him?" I asked. The 4 men exchanged glances. Thomas, who I guessed was in his late 30s, finally answered. "He's gone. That's all you need to know." I looked back at the list, reading it again. The rules were absurd. Talking fish, names called from the sea, but something in their expressions made the hair on my neck stand up. "So if I take this job, I need to follow these exactly," I said slowly. "No exceptions." "No exceptions," Captain Stevens confirmed. "Pays $300 a day, plus a percentage of the catch. We go out tomorrow at dawn, weather permitting." The money was even better than I'd heard. Almost too good. But I needed work, and my bank account was nearly empty. "I'll take it," I said. David nodded. "Good. Help us finish loading the supplies." For the next hour, I followed their lead, helping load nets, bait, and equipment onto the boat. I noticed how carefully they moved around certain parts of the vessel, the way they never stepped on particular spots without mumbling something under their breath. They worked with practiced precision, each movement deliberate. Thomas handed me a set of gloves. "You'll need these. Rope burns are the least of your worries out there." As evening approached, they began reviewing the departure procedures for the next morning. Captain Stevens pointed to the bow of the boat. "Before we leave harbor, you'll stand here and call out to the sea. Say, 'We are here to fish in peace.' Clearly, so it carries across the water. And that's important because," I tried to keep the skepticism out of my voice, "because it sets the terms," David explained, as if that clarified anything. "The sea needs to know our intentions." William was coiling rope nearby. "The rules protect us. We don't question them. We just follow them." I nodded, though none of this made sense. Either they were playing an elaborate prank, or they genuinely believed the ocean had some sort of consciousness that needed to be appeased. Part of me wanted to walk away, but I thought of my nearly empty wallet and the mounting calls from student loan servicers. "What time should I be here tomorrow?" I asked. 5:30, Captain Stevens said. "Don't be late." As we finished securing the boat for the night, Thomas pointed to a building up the street. "There's a boarding house 2 blocks up. Fishermen's rates. Most of us stay there when we're working." I picked up my duffel. "Thanks." Captain Stevens stepped off the boat last, locking a small compartment. "Get some sleep, Mitchell. Tomorrow we'll test everything you think you know about fishing." The gravity in his voice sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. The other men nodded soberly and began walking toward town. I fell in step beside David, who seemed the most approachable of the group. "Have you all been fishing together long?" "Robert and I grew up on these waters," he answered. "Our father taught us the rules. William's been with us 8 years. Thomas, 15. And you've all seen..." I hesitated, not sure how to phrase it. "Evidence? That these rules are necessary?" David stopped walking and looked at me directly. "Every single one. The sea doesn't forgive mistakes, Mitchell. Remember that." We continued to the boarding house in silence. I checked in, paid for a week in advance, and found my small room on the 2nd floor. After a quick shower, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the list of rules again. The whole thing seemed ridiculous in the safety of my room. Talking fish. Names called from the water. I'd worked on boats before and never encountered anything supernatural. But the fear and respect I'd seen in those men's eyes wasn't faked. They believed these rules kept them alive. I placed the list on the nightstand and set my alarm. Whatever games they were playing, I needed this job. I'd play along and collect my pay. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in the waters off Lunenburg that these men understood, and I did not. Something that made them willing to follow such strange rules without question. I woke before my alarm, my mind still processing the strange rules I'd agreed to follow. The boarding house was already stirring with the sounds of other fishermen preparing for their day. I dressed quickly, pulling on layers that would keep me warm on the open water, and headed down to the harbor while stars still dotted the sky. The Mary Catherine sat exactly where I'd left her the previous evening, but something about her seemed different in the pre-dawn light, more alive somehow. Captain Stevens and the others were already loading the last supplies. They worked with practiced efficiency, barely speaking. "Right on time," David said as I approached. "Ready for your first day?" I nodded, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "What do you need me to do?" "For now, help William with the bait buckets," Captain Stevens said, pointing toward the stern where William was organizing containers of chopped fish and squid. I fell into step beside William, who handed me a pair of thick gloves without looking up. "Put these on. The bait's been salted, but you still don't want it getting in any cuts." We worked in silence for several minutes before Captain Stevens called out from the wheelhouse. "Ready to cast off. Mitchell, take your position at the bow." The other men paused what they were doing, watching me expectantly. I made my way to the front of the boat, remembering what they'd told me the evening before. The water below was dark, lapping gently against the hull as the sky began to lighten. "Loud and clear," David prompted, "so it carries across the water." I took a deep breath, feeling ridiculous but unwilling to break their protocols on my first day. "We are here to fish in peace," I called out, my voice carrying across the still harbor. No one smiled or indicated this was a joke. Instead, they seemed to collectively relax, as if an important safety check had been completed. David nodded approvingly as I made my way back to help with the final preparations. Captain Stevens guided the Mary Catherine out of Lunenburg Harbor under a sky that was gradually transitioning from black to a muted gray. The town receded behind us, its colorful buildings growing smaller until they were just a smudge on the horizon. The sea stretched out in all directions, vast and indifferent. For the first hour, I concentrated on learning the equipment and procedures, following David's patient instructions. The work was physically demanding but straightforward. My earlier experience on the charter boat provided a basic foundation, though commercial fishing equipment was heavier and more industrial. Thomas worked nearby, checking the nets with practiced efficiency. He glanced up at the sky where thick clouds were beginning to gather. "Looks like the weather's going to," he started to say. David lunged across the deck with surprising speed, slapping his hand over Thomas's mouth. "Don't," he said firmly. Thomas's eyes widened in recognition. He nodded quickly and David removed his hand. "Sorry," Thomas muttered. "Wasn't thinking." The mood on the boat shifted instantly, everyone tensed, eyes darting between the sky and the water. I remembered the first rule on the list: never comment on the weather at sea, not even to say it's nice. Small waves began building around us, rocking the boat more noticeably. Captain Stevens adjusted our course slightly, his expression grim. No one spoke for several long minutes. Eventually, David moved closer to me. "We got lucky," he said quietly. He didn't finish his thought. If he had, he let the sentence hang unfinished. The waves gradually settled back to their previous rhythm. The tension among the crew eased, though Thomas kept his eyes down, focusing intently on his work. I wanted to ask questions, to understand what had nearly happened, but something told me this wasn't the time. Instead, I continued helping where directed, learning the routine of the boat. 2 hours into the trip, Captain Stevens steered us to a spot he deemed promising. The water here was deeper, its color shifting from gray-green to a darker blue-black. We prepared to cast the first nets of the day. I stood at the rail, helping feed out the heavy nets as William directed. The ocean spray hit my face, cold and bracing. That's when I heard it. "James." The voice came from directly below me, clear despite the sound of the boat's engine and the waves. I froze, looking down into the dark water. James Mitchell. It was impossible. The voice sounded like it was coming from just beneath the surface, as if someone was floating there calling up to me. I leaned forward, trying to see through the murky water. "James, look at me." William's head snapped up, his eyes locking on to me. Without hesitation, he dropped the net and lunged across the deck, grabbing my shoulder with one hand while pulling a fishing knife from his belt with the other. "Get him back," he barked to David, who immediately pulled me away from the rail. William drew the blade across his palm with a quick, practiced motion. Blood welled from the shallow cut, and he held his hand over the side, allowing 3 drops to fall into the ocean. "Blood payment," he said flatly. 3 drops freely given. The voice stopped immediately. The water churned briefly where the blood had fallen, then settled back to its normal pattern. "You heard it call you," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my heart pounding. "How did you know?" "Your face," William answered, wrapping a cloth around his cut hand. We've all seen that look before. Captain Stevens emerged from the wheelhouse, his expression grim. Everyone all right? William handled it. David confirmed. 3 drops. The captain nodded. Good. He looked at me. First time's always the strongest. It knows you're new. I tried to process what had just happened. The voice had been so clear, so specific, and they had all reacted as if this was a known danger, something they'd prepared for. What was that? I finally asked. What's in the water? The 4 men exchanged glances. David finally spoke. The sea knows all our names, he said. It calls to us sometimes, trying to lure us in. Newcomers are the most vulnerable. You don't know its tricks yet. Blood payment satisfies it, William added, flexing his bandaged hand. For a while, at least. I stared at the dark water, trying to reconcile my understanding of the world with what I'd just experienced. And if you hadn't stopped me? If I'd gone to the rail? You might have gone over, Thomas said bluntly. And we wouldn't have been able to find you. Captain Stevens returned to the wheelhouse, adjusting our course slightly. We'll move to deeper water. It's usually less active there. The others returned to their tasks with the same practiced efficiency they'd shown all morning, as if a voice calling from the ocean was just another workplace hazard to be managed. I followed their lead, helping prepare the nets while keeping well back from the rail. As we moved to a new fishing ground, David showed me how to properly cast and retrieve the nets. His instructions were clear and practical, yet I noticed how he positioned himself between me and the open water. The rules, I said quietly. They're not superstitions, are they? David glanced at me, his weathered face serious. No. They're survival. Every one of them was learned through someone's death. We cast the first nets of the day as the gray morning light strengthened around us. The boat settled into a rhythm of work, the men moving with the practiced coordination that comes from years of shared labor. I followed their lead, learning the patterns and procedures while keeping my mind firmly on the task at hand and away from the dark water surrounding us. The sea stretched out in all directions, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. For the first time, I understood why these men approached it with such careful respect. It wasn't just a workplace or a source of livelihood. It was something ancient and aware, with rules and appetites of its own. As I helped haul in the first catch, I silently accepted that the world was stranger and more dangerous than I had believed just 24 hours ago. And my survival depended on learning these rules, not just memorizing them, but understanding them with the same bone-deep conviction as the men around me. I helped haul in the nets with our first catch, my muscles straining against the weight. The earlier incident with the voice calling my name had left me shaken, but the rhythmic work of commercial fishing helped ground me in reality, or what I thought was reality before today. The crew worked around me with practiced motions, sorting fish into various containers as we emptied the bulging nets onto the deck. Captain Stevens stayed in the wheelhouse, guiding us to what he called better grounds, where the fish would be more plentiful. As we settled into a new spot and prepared to cast again, my hands moved automatically, mimicking the techniques David had shown me. During a brief lull, my mind wandered. The repetitive nature of the work left space for thoughts to drift, and mine traveled back to Halifax, to Sarah. I pictured her as we'd said goodbye 3 days ago, standing outside her apartment building. Her dark hair had blown across her face in the wind, and she'd tucked it behind her ear before kissing me. "Just be careful out there," she'd said. "The ocean isn't always friendly. Come back to me in one piece, okay?" I'd laughed then, thinking she was being dramatic. Now her words seemed oddly prophetic. I found myself smiling at the memory of her. We'd been together for almost 2 years, moving to Nova Scotia together after college. While I struggled to find steady work, Sarah had landed a good position at a marketing firm in Halifax, She'd been supportive when I told her about this fishing job, even though it meant being apart during the work week. "James," David's voice cut through my thoughts. "You with us?" I blinked, realizing I'd been staring at the water. "Sorry, just thinking." David followed my gaze to the ocean's surface and his expression changed. "About what?" "Nothing important," I lied, turning back to the nets. "You need to keep your mind on the work," he said, his tone sharper than before. "Remember Rule 2. I nodded, embarrassed at being caught daydreaming on my first day. But as I looked back toward the water, something caught my eye. The surface seemed different somehow, brighter, almost shimmering where the morning light hit it. At first, I thought it was just sunlight playing on the waves. Then I saw her. Sarah was just beneath the surface, looking up at me. Her dark hair floated around her face like a halo, her eyes wide and bright. She smiled, reaching one hand toward me. I froze, certain I was hallucinating. She couldn't be here. She was in Halifax, miles away. Yet there she was, clear as day, swimming just below the boat. "Sarah?" I whispered, moving closer to the rail. David's head snapped up. He tracked my gaze to the water and cursed under his breath. "Thomas! William!" he called, his voice urgent. "We've got another one!" The shimmering intensified. Sarah's face became more distinct, her features perfect and familiar. She pressed her palm against the underside of the water's surface, as if it were glass. "James," her voice came clearly through the water. "I found the most beautiful place. You need to see it." Her voice was exactly right. The same gentle lilt, the same cadence. My heart ached at the sound of it. "How did you get here?" I asked, leaning forward. William appeared at my side, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. Thomas moved to my other side, both men holding me firmly as I tried to get closer to the rail. "It's not her," William said firmly. "Look at me, Mitchell. That's not Sarah." But I couldn't look away from her face. She seemed so real, so present. Her expression turned pleading. "James, please, it's incredible down here. I want to show you. Just reach down and take my hand." I strained against the men's grip. Some part of me recognized the danger, remembered the rules, but a stronger part just wanted to be closer to her. "Mitchell," Thomas's voice was sharp in my ear. "What were the last words Sarah actually said to you? The real Sarah, back in Halifax?" The question cut through the fog in my mind. I struggled to think back to our goodbye. She told me to be careful," I said, still watching the figure in the water. "That the ocean isn't always friendly." "What else?" William demanded, tightening his grip on my arm. What were her exact words? I forced myself to concentrate, to remember the moment precisely. She said, "Come back to me in one piece, okay?" The moment the words left my mouth, the figure in the water changed. Sarah's beautiful face twisted, her features contorting with sudden rage. Her mouth opened too wide, revealing rows of teeth that no human mouth could contain. "You could have joined her," the thing said. Its voice no longer Sarah's, but something ancient and cold. "We would have kept you together forever." Then it dissolved, the shimmering water returning to ordinary gray-green waves lapping against the hull. I sagged in the men's grip, suddenly weak-kneed and nauseated. They carefully guided me to sit on a storage crate, keeping me well away from the rail. "Breathe," David instructed, handing me a canteen of water. First time's always the worst. I took several deep breaths, trying to process what I'd seen. That wasn't real. "No," Thomas agreed, but it wasn't exactly fake either. The sea knows what we want most. What we miss, it uses that. "Rule 2 exists for a reason," William added, returning to his work but keeping a watchful eye on me. "Homesickness kills more fishermen than storms ever did." David stayed beside me until my breathing steadied. "Think you can get back to work?" I nodded, still shaken but determined not to let it show. "I'm fine." Good man, he said. Focus on the tasks. Keep your mind here, not on shore. For the next hour, I threw myself into the work with renewed intensity, focusing on the physical demands of fishing to keep my thoughts from wandering. I helped cast and retrieve nets, sort catches, and prepare bait with mechanical precision. My back ached, and my hands were sore despite the gloves, but the pain kept me grounded. We moved to a third location around mid-morning. The captain seemed dissatisfied with our catches so far, muttering to David about currents and water temperature as they consulted charts in the wheelhouse. Thomas showed me how to work with a smaller casting net along the port side while the main nets were being reset. He demonstrated the proper technique, then handed the net to me. Cast it wide, pull it in slow, he instructed. Sometimes the smaller nets catch what the big ones miss. I followed his directions, swinging the net as he'd shown me and letting it unfurl across the water's surface. The weighted edges sank quickly, creating a perfect circle that slowly descended. When I began to pull it back, I could feel resistance. Something had been caught. I hauled the net up carefully, excited at the prospect of my first solo catch. As it breached the surface, I saw a large cod thrashing in the mesh, its silver-gray scales catching the light. Good one? Thomas nodded approvingly. Bring it on board. I maneuvered the net over the rail and lowered it to the deck. As I bent down to release the fish from the mesh, it stopped thrashing and turned one eye directly toward me. Please don't kill me, it said. The voice was high and childlike, but clear as any human speech. I jerked back, nearly falling over in shock. I can give you whatever you want, the fish continued, its mouth moving in perfect sync with the words. Money, power, I know where shipwrecks full of treasure are. Just put me back, and I'll show you. I looked around wildly. Thomas stood nearby, watching me intently but making no move to help. William and David had both paused in their work, observing from different parts of the deck. No one else can hear me, the fish said, seeming to sense my confusion. Only you. This is a special opportunity just for you. Now think about it. You could be rich by tonight. I remembered Rule 4. If you catch a fish that speaks, throw it back without saying a word. The cod's offers grew more elaborate. I know secrets about the universe, things no human has ever known. I can tell you how to live forever. I can make that girl love you more than anything. All these other men are fools. They throw away fortune after fortune. My hands trembled as I worked to free it from the net. The fish's voice became increasingly desperate as I lifted it. Wait, you don't understand what you're giving up. I can protect you from the sea itself. No harm will ever come to you if you just speak to me. I kept my mouth firmly shut as I walked to the rail. The fish thrashed in my hands, its voice rising to a frantic pitch. You think these rules keep you safe? They're just delaying the inevitable. Speak to me, and I'll tell you what they don't want you to know. With a quick motion, I tossed the fish over the side. It hit the water with a splash and disappeared beneath the surface without another word or sign. I stood at the rail for a moment, my heart pounding. When I turned back, the three men were watching me with approval. Well done, David said simply. Thomas clapped me on the shoulder as he passed. You're learning. Captain Stevens had emerged from the wheelhouse in time to witness my action. He gave me a single nod before returning to his post. I picked up the empty net and began untangling it. My hands steadier now. 2 rules tested, 2 rules proven true. Whatever was happening in these waters went beyond superstition or coincidence. Does that happen often? I asked David as he helped me coil the net. Often enough, he replied. The smarter ones try to tempt you with exactly what you want most. They're good at guessing. And if I had spoken to it? David's expression darkened. Fish with human voices don't come from the sea. They come from somewhere else, somewhere deeper. You don't want to make deals with whatever lives down there. I nodded, no longer skeptical. In the space of a morning, my understanding of the world had fundamentally changed. The ocean wasn't just water and fish and scientific principles. It was alive in some way I couldn't fully comprehend, testing and tempting those who ventured onto its surface. As we reset the nets for another cast, I kept my mind firmly on the work at hand, careful not to let my thoughts drift toward shore or home. The rules made sense now, not as superstitions, but as hard-earned wisdom passed down by those who had survived these waters. The Mary Catherine continued its slow journey across the fishing grounds, harvesting the sea's bounty while carefully navigating its dangers. I watched the other men work, noting how their caution never slipped, how their respect for the water never wavered. If I wanted to survive this job, I would need to learn the same careful balance. The afternoon stretched on as we continued fishing in the cold Atlantic waters. After my encounter with the talking fish, I had thrown myself into the work with renewed focus, determined to follow every rule to the letter. The crew had fallen into a steady rhythm, casting nets, hauling them in, sorting the catch, and preparing for the next cast. It was physically demanding work, but I was starting to get the hang of it. By early afternoon, I noticed something strange. My personal bucket contained several decent-sized fish, as did those belonging to David, William, and Thomas. But Captain Stevens's bucket remained empty. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the Atlantic wind. Rule 6. The captain must catch his own fish and never be given another's. I watched Robert as he cast his personal line again, his movements betraying a growing tension. His face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around the fishing rod. The rest of the crew had noticed too. David kept glancing toward his brother between tasks, his expression growing more concerned with each hour that passed. "We're moving again," Robert announced from the wheelhouse, his voice tight. "There's a better spot 2 miles east." No one questioned the decision. William and Thomas secured the equipment for the short journey, while David motioned for me to help him with the larger nets. "Is this normal?" I asked quietly as we worked. "For the captain to have trouble catching anything?" David's eyes darted toward the wheelhouse before he answered, "No, not like this." As we reached the new location, Robert emerged from the wheelhouse and took up his position at the starboard rail. He cast his line with practiced precision, but the minutes ticked by with no result. Meanwhile, the main nets we had cast came up heavy with fish, cod, haddock, and mackerel thrashed in the mesh as we hauled them aboard. Thomas and William sorted the catch efficiently, their movements quick but careful as they added fish to the ice-packed holds. I helped where needed, learning the proper handling techniques while keeping a respectful distance from the rail. Every so often, I caught the crew exchanging worried glances. Robert tried different lures, different depths, even moving to various positions around the boat. Nothing worked. The sun had passed its zenith and begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. We'd been at sea for hours, and the captain had yet to catch a single fish. The mood on the boat grew increasingly tense. I sorted my catch, placing several good-sized fish in my personal bucket as instructed. Each time I caught something, I could feel Robert's eyes on me briefly before he returned to his own fruitless efforts. After what must have been his 20th failed attempt, Robert slammed his rod into its holder with barely controlled frustration. "Current's wrong here," he muttered, though the nets were still bringing in plenty for the rest of us. "We'll try the North Channel." As Robert returned to the wheelhouse, David approached him, speaking in a low voice. "Robert, we've got more than enough for a good day's haul. We could head back now." "Not until I've caught my share," Robert replied firmly. "You know the rules." David hesitated, then glanced back at his own bucket. "You could take one of mine. No one would know the difference." Robert's face hardened. "I would know, and so would the sea." "We've been out here for hours," David persisted. "The light will be failing soon." "Then I'd better catch something quickly, hadn't I?" Robert turned away, ending the conversation as he guided the Mary Catherine toward yet another fishing spot. The sky had begun to take on the golden hues of late afternoon by the time we dropped anchor again. Robert cast his line immediately, his jaw set in determination. The rest of us continued working with the main nets, but the easy conversation that had flowed earlier in the day had died completely. Even Thomas, who had been explaining various fishing techniques to me throughout the day, had fallen silent. After another hour of watching Robert's increasing frustration, Thomas approached the captain with a steady gaze. He carried his personal bucket, which contained several impressive catches. "Captain," he said quietly, "take mine." Robert shook his head without looking away from the water. "You know I can't do that." "The day's almost gone," Thomas insisted. "We need to start back before dark." "I'll catch something," Robert said through gritted teeth. "I always do." Thomas set his bucket down and reached in, pulling out a large silver mackerel that gleamed in the late afternoon light. It was easily the best catch of the day, fat and healthy, with scales that caught the sunlight like polished metal. "This one's special," Thomas said, holding it up. "Biggest mackerel I've seen this season. Take it." "Thomas," David called from across the deck, a warning in his voice. "Don't." I looked between them, confused by the intensity of the moment. William had stopped working entirely, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. Thomas ignored David, stepping closer to Robert. "You've brought us safely out and back for 15 years, Captain. Let me do this." Something passed between the two men, an understanding that went beyond words. Robert looked at the fish, then back at Thomas's face. "You know what you're offering," Robert said, his voice barely audible over the sound of waves against the hull. Thomas nodded once, his expression solemn but resolved. "I do." After what seemed like an eternity, Robert reached out and took the mackerel from Thomas's hands. The transfer was almost ceremonial, both men handling the fish with careful respect. Robert placed it in his empty bucket, which had sat waiting all day. The change was immediate. The water around the boat, which had been a normal gray-blue all day, suddenly darkened to an unsettling shade of green. The surface became glassy smooth, despite the steady breeze that had been blowing all afternoon. A heavy silence fell, as if even the constant sounds of water and wind had been muffled. I turned to ask what was happening, but the words died in my throat. Thomas stood at the rail, looking out over the water with a strange calmness. His yellow rain jacket seemed to glow against the darkened sea. Then, between one blink and the next, he was gone. His empty rain jacket floated where he had been standing just a moment before, gradually sinking into the unnaturally still water. No splash, no cry, no struggle. Thomas Wright had simply vanished. "No!" David lunged forward, reaching for the jacket, but William caught his arm. "Don't," William said, his voice tight. "It's done." I stared at the spot where Thomas had been, unable to process what I had just witnessed. One moment he had been there, solid and real, and the next, nothing. The sea had taken him so completely, so efficiently, that it seemed impossible. Robert stood motionless, the bucket with Thomas's fish at his feet. His face was etched with grief, but not surprise. He had known this would happen. They all had. Slowly, deliberately, Robert bent down and picked up the bucket. He carried it to the main hold and emptied it, adding Thomas's remaining catch to the communal pile. The action seemed both practical and respectful, acknowledging the sacrifice while ensuring it wasn't wasted. "Secure the equipment," he said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "We're heading back." David and William moved with quiet efficiency, preparing the boat for the return journey. I joined them, helping to stow gear and tie down loose items, though my hands were shaking. The sea had returned to its normal color and movement, as if nothing unusual had occurred. As I whispered to William, "He did that on purpose, didn't he? He knew what would happen." William nodded once, his eyes on the task before him. Rule 6 exists for a reason. The captain must catch his own fish. Someone who gives or steals another's catch pays the price. If Robert had returned without catching anything, the sea would have claimed all of us, William explained quietly. Thomas made a choice, 1 life instead of 5. Robert guided the Mary Catherine away from the spot where Thomas had disappeared, setting course for Lunenburg. David took over securing the last of the equipment, his movements mechanical and precise despite the grief evident in his posture. I helped William clean the deck, washing away fish scales and blood with buckets of seawater. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? A man I had met just yesterday was gone, claimed by supernatural forces I couldn't begin to comprehend. And yet the routine of the boat continued. The engines hummed, the equipment was stowed, and we prepared to return to port as if this were any normal day. As I rinsed blood from the deck, I finally understood why the previous crew member had disappeared, why these men followed their strange rules with such devotion. This wasn't superstition. The sea was alive in some terrible way, enforcing its rules with merciless efficiency. The list I had been given wasn't a collection of quaint fishing traditions. It was a survival guide written in the blood of those who had learned the hard way. I looked out over the water stretching to the horizon. Beneath its ordinary surface lurked something ancient and powerful. Something that watched and waited and knew our names. Something that demanded respect and exacted payment for any transgression. As the Mary Catherine turned toward Lunenburg, I understood that Thomas Wright would never be coming back. The Mary Catherine carved through the darkening water, heading back toward Lunenburg harbor. Nobody spoke. The absence of Thomas hung in the air between us, heavier than the thickest sea fog. I kept looking at the spot where he had been standing just minutes ago, expecting, hoping, that somehow he'd reappear. But there was only empty space and the gentle flap of rigging in the wind. Robert stayed in the wheelhouse, his face set in stone as he guided us home. His hands moved with practiced precision over the controls, but I caught the slight tremor in them when he adjusted our course. David had taken up position near the stern, staring out at our wake as if searching for some sign of Thomas in the churning water behind us. William and I worked together, securing equipment and cleaning the deck. We moved around each other in a careful dance, our actions mechanical and precise. The repetitive work gave my hands something to do while my mind tried to process what I had witnessed. "We should rinse down the gutting station," William said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice sounded rough, like he hadn't used it in days rather than hours. I nodded and grabbed a bucket, dipping it into the ocean. The water looked normal now, just regular seawater, gray-blue and cold, not the unnaturally still green surface that had swallowed Thomas without a sound or splash. As I scrubbed at dried blood and fish scales, I tried to make sense of it all. Thomas had known what would happen when he handed that fish to Robert. He'd made that choice with open eyes and a steady hand. What kind of rules were these that men would die to follow them? The harbor lights appeared on the horizon, small yellow dots against the darkening sky. Robert adjusted our course slightly, bringing us in line with the channel markers. I finished cleaning and stood at the rail watching our approach. David came to stand beside me, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. "You okay?" I asked, immediately feeling stupid for the question. He gave a slight shrug. "Been fishing these waters 25 years. You learn to live with the losses." "But Thomas made his choice." David cut me off gently. He knew what would happen. Robert emerged from the wheelhouse, his captain's hat pulled low over his eyes. He joined us at the rail, looking toward the approaching harbor. "Thomas was a good fisherman," he said simply. 15 years on my boat. He understood the rules better than most. I swallowed hard before asking, "Why did he do it? Give you his fish?" Robert looked at me directly for the first time since we'd left the fishing grounds. Because if I had returned without catching anything, the sea would have taken all of us. That's the price for breaking Rule 6. So he sacrificed himself, I said, the words feeling inadequate for what had happened. He made a choice, Robert corrected. 1 life instead of 5. That's the bargain Thomas made with the sea. We fell silent again as the harbor drew closer. The light was fading fast now, the sun dipping below the horizon behind us. Other fishing boats were already docked, their crews unloading catches or heading to town. Normal, everyday activities that seemed impossibly mundane after what we'd witnessed. "What about the man I replaced?" I asked. William, who had joined us silently, nodded. "Thought he was doing the captain a favor. Slipped one of his fish into Robert's bucket when no one was looking. The sea always knows," David added quietly. "You can't trick it." The engines throttled back as Robert guided us toward our slip. William and David moved to their positions automatically, preparing lines to secure us to the dock. I followed their lead, taking up a position near the bow with a coiled rope in my hands. We docked with practiced efficiency, the Mary Catherine settling against the weathered wood with a gentle bump. One by one, we stepped off onto solid ground. My legs felt strange after hours on the water, the dock seeming to sway beneath my feet though it was perfectly still. A weathered man in a heavy jacket approached as we began unloading our catch. The harbor master, I guessed. His eyes scanned our faces, lingering on the empty space where Thomas should have been. "Good catch today?" he asked, though his eyes said he knew the more important question. "Fair," Robert answered. "Market should be pleased." The harbor master nodded, glancing again at our reduced number. "Right? Won't be coming back," Robert said simply. The older man's face showed no surprise, just a flicker of something like resignation. He made a small note on his clipboard and helped us unload the catch onto the weighing station. I realized then that this was not an unusual occurrence in Lunenburg. Men went out to sea and sometimes didn't return. The specific circumstances might vary, but the result was the same. Empty chairs at dinner tables, names spoken in hushed tones, boots that would never again walk these docks. We unloaded the fish in near silence, working together to transfer our catch to the processing facility. Once the boat was empty and clean, Robert gathered us near the dock office. "We'll take 2 days," he said. "Be ready to go out again on Thursday morning if the weather holds." He reached into his pocket and pulled out several envelopes, handing one to each of us. "Day's pay plus your share of the catch." I took mine with a nod, feeling the weight of the cash inside. It seemed wrong somehow, being paid for a day that had ended with a man's death. But this was the reality of the fishing life, dangerous work that continued regardless of losses. "What about Thomas's share?" I asked. "We'll go to his sister in Halifax," Robert answered. "She's the only family he had left." David picked up his gear and nodded toward town. "Come on, I'll walk with you." I followed him up the dock, leaving Robert and William to finish the last details of securing the boat for the night. The town was lighting up as businesses switched on their evening lights, restaurants filled with customers, and the normal rhythm of life continued. "Thomas fished these waters for 15 years, David said as we walked. "He knew what he was doing today." "You tried to stop him," I pointed out. David nodded. "Instinct, I guess." But he'd made up his mind. He paused, looking toward the darkening ocean behind us. Some men, after enough time on the water, they develop a relationship with the sea. They understand it in ways the rest of us can't fully grasp. We reached the boarding house and stopped outside. I could see other fishermen moving about inside, their silhouettes visible through lit windows. Men who had returned safely today, who would go out again tomorrow or the next day to tempt fate once more. "Thomas never married," David continued. "No kids. Most of the long-term crew are like that." "Because of the risk?" I asked. "Because they know what's out there," he answered simply. "Hard to build a life on shore when you understand what waits beneath the water." He clapped me on the shoulder once, a brief gesture of camaraderie. "Get some rest. Robert meant what he said about Thursday. You're welcome back on the Mary Catherine if you want the work. I'll think about it, I said, though I wasn't sure what there was to think about. I had witnessed something impossible today. A man vanishing into calm water without a trace. I had heard my name called from the depths, seen a fish speak with human words, and watched the sea claim a life for breaking its rules. David nodded and turned away, heading toward his own home somewhere in town. I climbed the steps to the boarding house, my body suddenly aware of every ache from the day's labor. Inside, I nodded to a few other fishermen sitting in the common room before making my way upstairs to my room. Once alone, I emptied my envelope onto the bed, $300 cash, plus a slip indicating my percentage of the catch value would be available tomorrow at the harbor office. Good money, exactly as promised. Enough to keep me going while I looked for other work, if that's what I decided. I sat on the edge of the bed, the rules list still in my pocket. I pulled it out and read through the 6 items again, now understanding their deadly importance. These weren't superstitions or odd traditions. They were survival instructions, each one learned through someone's death. I thought about Thomas Wright, a man I had barely known but whose last act had saved my life along with the others. He had faced his end with dignity and purpose, making a choice that few would have the courage to make. Outside my window, the harbor lights reflected on the water's surface. Beneath that seemingly peaceful blanket lurked something ancient and powerful, something that knew our names and enforced its rules without mercy or exception. The fishermen of Lunenburg had learned to work with it, to respect its power and follow its strange requirements. I placed the list on my nightstand and stretched out on the bed, too tired to even remove my clothes. Tomorrow I would need to decide whether to return to the Mary Catherine on Thursday or find another path. Tonight, with the memory of Thomas's calm face as he handed over his fish still fresh in my mind, I simply needed to rest and come to terms with a world far stranger and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I woke to sunlight filtering through thin curtains and the distant cry of gulls. For a moment, I lay still, trying to shake the uneasy dreams that had plagued me throughout the night. Visions of dark water and Thomas's face as he handed over that fateful fish. My muscles ached from yesterday's work, a physical reminder of everything that had happened on the Mary Catherine. After a quick shower, I dressed and headed downstairs. The boarding house was quiet, most of the fishermen already gone for the day. I nodded to the elderly woman who managed the place as she swept the entryway floor. "Heading out today?" she asked, her weathered face showing little curiosity. "Not until Thursday," I replied, realizing she'd noticed I wasn't rushing to the docks like the others. She nodded once. "Heard about Thomas Wright. Shame that." I paused, unsure how to respond. "You knew him?" "Stayed here whenever he was working, 15 years, off and on." She continued sweeping. "Always paid on time, kept to himself. That's how it goes sometimes." The casual acceptance in her voice told me everything. In this town, fishermen disappeared regularly enough that it warranted little more than a passing comment. I thanked her and stepped outside into the cool morning air. Lunenburg spread before me, its colorful buildings gleaming in the morning light. I walked toward the harbor, my feet carrying me back to the water despite everything I'd witnessed yesterday. The town was fully awake now, shops opening and locals going about their business. Tourists wandered along the main streets, taking photos of the picturesque harbor view, completely unaware of what lurked beneath those photogenic waves. I reached the waterfront and walked slowly along the docks, watching the fishing crews prepare their boats. With new awareness, I noticed things I would have missed before yesterday. The careful way each person moved around their vessel, the small rituals performed before equipment was loaded, the quiet words spoken at specific moments. One captain touched the bow of his boat 3 times before stepping aboard. On another vessel, the entire crew paused briefly at the rail, their heads bowed for several seconds before they resumed work. A third boat had small marks painted near the waterline, freshly touched up each morning from what I could tell. Each crew had their own version of rules and rituals, their own hard-won knowledge of what kept them safe on these waters. I wondered how many had learned their particular practices through tragedy. How many empty chairs sat at dinner tables across Lunenburg because someone had broken a rule or forgotten a crucial ritual. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. I turned away from the docks and headed toward a small diner I'd spotted yesterday, its windows steamy and the smell of coffee and bacon wafting from the open door. Inside, the diner was warm and crowded with a mix of locals and tourists. I scanned the room and was surprised to see David Stevens sitting alone at a corner booth, nursing a mug of coffee. He glanced up as I entered, his eyes showing a flicker of recognition before he nodded slightly in greeting. I ordered coffee and breakfast at the counter, then made my way over to his table. "Mind if I join you?" I asked. David gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Free country." I slid into the booth, wrapping my hands around the warm mug the waitress had given me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The events of yesterday hung between us, unspoken but impossible to ignore. "How are you holding up?" David finally asked, his voice low. I considered the question. Still processing, I guess. It's a lot to take in. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. First time seeing the sea take someone is always the hardest. "Is that common?" I asked. "What happened to Thomas?" David took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "Common enough. Most crews lose someone eventually if they fish these waters long enough." "And everyone follows rules like yours?" "Every crew working these waters has their own version," David confirmed, keeping his voice low despite the ambient noise of the diner. "Specifics vary between boats, between families. Some have 7 rules, some have 5. The Stevens family has 6. My breakfast arrived, eggs, bacon, and toast piled high on a plate. I thanked the waitress and picked up my fork, though my appetite had diminished with the turn in conversation. "How long have these rules existed?" I asked after taking a few bites. "Hard to say exactly. The sea off Nova Scotia has always demanded respect." David pushed his empty plate aside. Indigenous fishermen had their own protocols before Europeans arrived. Early settlers learned quick that these waters were different. Each generation passes down what they know, adds what they've learned through their own losses. I thought about the rules I'd been given, the strange, specific prohibitions that had seemed so bizarre just yesterday morning. And it's really the sea itself that enforces them. David's eyes met mine, serious and steady. "What would you call it after what you saw yesterday?" He had me there. I couldn't explain what had happened to Thomas as anything natural or coincidental. One moment he had been standing there, the next he was simply gone, claimed by unnaturally still waters for breaking a rule. "I keep thinking about Thomas," I said, pushing eggs around my plate. "Did he have family? Anyone who'll miss him?" "Sister in Halifax," David replied. "Robert's arranging to send her his final pay and belongings. Beyond that, Thomas kept to himself. No wife, no kids. Is that normal for fishermen around here?" David's lips curved in a humorless smile. "More common than you might think, especially among the long-termers. Hard to build a life on shore when you understand what waits beneath the water. Some men try. Robert has a wife, for instance, but many choose to stay unattached." I thought about Sarah back in Halifax, wondering what she would say if I told her what I'd witnessed. Would she even believe me? The story sounded insane, even in my own head. "What about you?" I asked. "No family?" "Married once, years back. Didn't stick." David's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the harbor, visible in the distance. She couldn't understand why I kept going back to the water after my first close call. Said I loved the sea more than her. He shrugged. Maybe she was right. We finished our meals in comfortable silence. David paid his bill and stood, adjusting his cap. "Robert's down at the boat, checking equipment for Thursday," he told me. "If you're planning to come back out with us, might want to let him know. Plenty of men looking for work who wouldn't ask questions about Thomas." I nodded, though I hadn't fully decided yet. "I'll stop by." David studied me for a moment. "Whatever you choose, the rules don't stop working just because you're not on our boat. Remember that." With that cryptic warning, he left, the bell above the door tinkling as he stepped out into the morning air. I sat for a while longer, finishing my coffee and thinking about my options. I could walk away from Lunenburg today, take my pay, catch a bus back to Halifax, and never set foot on another fishing boat. I could tell myself that what I'd witnessed was some mass hallucination or elaborate hoax. I could pretend the ocean was just water and fish, not a sentient force that knew our names and enforced its strange rules with deadly efficiency. But I knew I wouldn't. After paying my bill, I walked back to the harbor, my steps purposeful now. The Mary Catherine sat where we had left her yesterday, her weathered hull rocking gently against the dock. Captain Robert Stevens was on board, methodically checking equipment and making notes on a clipboard. He looked up as my boots thumped on the dock, his eyes narrowing slightly against the sun. He didn't seem surprised to see me, though something like relief flickered briefly across his face. "Mitchell," he acknowledged with a nod. "Captain," I replied, stepping onto the deck. The boat felt different now. Not just a vessel, but something like a boundary between worlds, a fragile protection against forces I was only beginning to understand. Robert set down his clipboard and turned to face me fully. "Made your decision, then?" I nodded. "I'll be here Thursday morning, if you still want me on crew." "We need the hands," he said simply, "especially now." "I need the work," I admitted, "and I've developed a healthy respect for the sea's power." A grim smile crossed Robert's weathered face. "Good. Respect will keep you alive out there." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to me. I opened it to find a fresh copy of the 6 rules, written in the same neat handwriting as the first list I'd been given. "Keep it with you," he advised. "We'll be taking on someone new to replace Thomas. Might want you to help train them, show them the ropes. Sometimes it helps hearing it from someone who's recently learned the hard way." I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my breast pocket, nodding my understanding. Robert turned back to his clipboard but paused before continuing his inspection. "Thomas was a good man," he said, his voice rough with emotion he clearly wasn't comfortable showing. 15 years on my boat. Never gave me reason to doubt him." "He saved all our lives," I acknowledged quietly. Robert nodded once, sharply. "That he did." He cleared his throat. "If you're here, might as well make yourself useful. Need to check the port side rigging." I recognized the change of subject for what it was, a return to the practical work of fishing, the daily tasks that kept the boat running and the crew alive. I moved to help, familiarizing myself with the equipment as Robert pointed out what needed attention. We worked in companionable silence for almost an hour, the routine physical labor calming my mind. As I coiled a length of rope, I looked out across the harbor to the open ocean beyond. Somewhere out there, beneath the waves, was whatever had taken Thomas. The same force that had called my name, shown me Sarah's face, and spoken to me through a fish's mouth. I had signed on for dangerous work, but unlike the dangers I had anticipated, storms, accidents, the ordinary risks of commercial fishing, these threats came from something beyond human understanding. My survival would depend not on skill or strength, but on respecting rules that made no logical sense yet had been proven in blood. As I finished the task and moved on to the next, I accepted that this was my path forward, at least for now. The pay was good, the work was honest, and I had found a crew who would teach me what I needed to know to survive. In a world suddenly revealed to be stranger and more dangerous than I had ever imagined, that would have to be enough.